Chapter 6, Part 2 of Melmoth the Wanderer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kendra Lee Oberhauser, Berkeley, California. KendraLeeOberhauser.com. Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Chapter 6, Part 2. As he uttered these words, he rushed for my cell. The moments I passed during his absence were, I think, the most horrible of my life. Their terror was aggravated by darkness, for it was now night, and he had carried away the light along with him. My agitation did not at first permit me to observe this. I felt I was in the dark, but knew not how or why. 1,000 images of indescribable horror rushed in a host on me. I had heard much of the terrors of convents, of their punishments, often carried to the infliction of death, or of reducing their victim to a state in which death would have been a blessing. Dungeons, chains, and scourges swam before my eyes in a fiery mist. The threatening words of the superior appeared emblazoned on the darkened walls of my cell in characters of flame. I shuddered. I cried aloud, though conscious that my voice would be echoed by no friendly answering tones in a community of 60 persons. Such is the sterility of humanity in a convent. At last, my very fears recovered me by their excess. I said to myself, they dare not murder me. They dare not incarcerate me. They are answerable to the court to which I have appealed for my forthcoming. They dare not be guilty of any violence. Just as I had come to this comfortable conclusion, which indeed was the triumph of my sophistry of hope, the door of my cell was thrown open, and the superior, attended by his 4 satellites, re-entered. My eyes were dim from the darkness in which I had been left, but I could distinguish that they carried with them a rope and a piece of sackcloth. I drew the most frightful presages from this apparatus. I altered my reasoning in a moment, and instead of saying they dare not do so and so, I instantly argued, what dare they not do? I am in their power, they know it. I have provoked them to the utmost. What is it monks will not do in the impotence of their malignity? What is to become of me? They advanced, and I imagined the rope was to strangle me, and the sackcloth to enclose my murdered body. 1,000 images of blood swam before me, a gush of fire choked up my respiration. The groans of 1,000 victims seemed to rise from the vaults of the convent, to which they had been hurried by a fate like mine. I know not what is death, but I am convinced I suffered the agonies of many deaths in that moment. My first impulse was to throw myself on my knees. I said, I am in your power. I am guilty in your eyes. Accomplish your purpose, but do not keep me long in pain. The superior, without heeding or perhaps hearing me, said, now you are in the posture that becomes you. At hearing these words, which sounded less dreadful than I had feared, I prostrated myself to the ground. A few moments before, I would have thought this a degradation, but fear is very debasing. I had a dread of violent means. I was very young, and this life was not the less attractive from its being arrayed only in the brilliant drapery of imagination. The monks observed my posture. They feared its effect on the superior. They said, in that choral monotony, that discordant unison, that had frozen my blood when I knelt in the same posture but a few nights before, Reverend Father, do not suffer yourself to be imposed on by this prostituted humiliation. The time for mercy is past. You gave him his moments of deliberation. He refused to avail himself of them. You come now not to listen to pleadings, but to inflict justice." At these words, that announced everything horrible, I went on my knees from one to the other, as they all stood in a grim and executioner-like row. I said to each with tears, "Brother Clement, Brother Justin, why do you try to irritate the superior against me? Why do you precipitate a sentence which, whether just or not, must be severe, since you are to be the executioners? What have I done to offend you? I interceded for you when you were guilty of any slight deviation. Is this my return?" "This is wasting time," said the monks. "Hold," said the superior, "give him will to speak. Will you avail yourself of the last moment of indulgence I can ever afford you, to renounce your horrible resolution of recalling your vows?" These words renewed all my energies. I stood upright before them all. I said, in a loud, distinct voice, "Never. I stand at the bar of God." "Wretch, you have renounced God." "Well then, my father, I have only to hope that God will not renounce me. I have appealed to a bar also, over which you have no power." "But we have power here, and that you shall feel." He made a signal, and the 4 monks approached. I uttered one short cry of fear, but submitted the next moment. I felt convinced it was to be my last. I was astonished when, instead of fastening the cords round my neck, they bound my arms with them. They then took off my habit and covered me with a sackcloth. I made no resistance. But shall I confess to you, sir, I felt some disappointment. I was prepared for death, but something worse than death appeared threatened in these preparations. When we are driven to the precipice of mortality, we spring forward with resolution, and often defeat the triumph of our murderers by merging it in our own. But when we are led to it step by step, held often over it, and then withdrawn, we lose our resolution along with our patience, and feel that the last blow would be mercy, compared with its long suspended, slowly descending, wavering, mutilating, hesitating stroke. I was prepared for everything but what followed. Bound with this rope as fast as a felon, or a galley slave, and covered only with the sackcloth, they dragged me along the gallery. I uttered no cry, made no resistance. They descended the stairs that led to the church. I followed, or rather was dragged after them. They crossed the aisle. There was a dark passage near it which I had never observed before. We entered it. A low door at the end presented a frightful perspective. At sight of it, I cried aloud, "You will not immure me! You will not plunge me in that horrible dungeon, to be withered by damps and devoured by reptiles? No, you will not. Remember, you are answerable for my life." At these words, they surrounded me. Then, for the first time, I struggled. I called for help. This was the moment they waited for. They wanted some repugnance on my part. The signal was instantly given to a lay brother, who waited in the passage. The bell was rung, that terrible bell that requires every member of a convent to plunge into his cell, as something extraordinary is going on in the house. At the first toll, I lost all hope. I felt as if not a living being was in existence, but those who surrounded me, and who appeared, in the livid light of one taper burning faintly in that dismal passage, like spectres hurrying a condemned soul to his doom. They hurried me down the steps to this door, which was considerably below the level of the passage. It was a long time before they could open it. Many keys were tried. Perhaps they might have felt some agitation at the thoughts of the violence they were going to commit. But this delay increased my terrors beyond expression. I imagined this terrible vault had never been unclosed before, that I was to be the first victim inhumed within it, and that their determination was, I should never quit it alive. As these thoughts occurred, in unutterable agony I cried aloud, though I felt I was beyond all human hearing. But my cries were drowned in the jarring of the heavy door, as it yielded to the efforts of the monks, who, uniting their strength, pushed it with extended arms, grating all the way against the floor of stone. The monks hurried me in, while the superior stood at the entrance with a light, appearing to shudder at the view it disclosed. I had time to view all the furniture of what I thought was my last abode. It was of stone. The roof formed an arch, a block of stone supported a crucifix, and a death's head with a loaf and a pitcher of water. There was a mat on the floor to lie on. Another rolled up at the end of it formed a pillow. They flung me on it, and prepared to depart. I no longer struggled, for I knew escape was in vain, but I supplicated them at least to leave me a light, and I petitioned for this with as much earnestness as I could have done for my liberty. Thus it is that misery always breaks down the mind into petty details. We have not strength to comprehend the whole of our calamity. We feel not the mountain which is heaped on us, but the nearest grains press on and grind us. I said, "In Christian mercy, leave me a light, if it be but to defend myself against the reptiles that must swarm here." And already I saw this was true, for some of extraordinary size, disturbed by the phenomenon of the light, came crawling down the walls. At this time, the monks were straining their strength to close the heavy door. They did not utter a word. "I adjure you to leave me light, if it is but to gaze on that skull. Fear not the exercise of sight can be any indulgence in this place, but still let me have a light. Think that when I wish to pray, I must feel my way to the crucifix." As I spoke, the door was with difficulty closed and locked, and I heard their departing steps. You will hardly believe, sir, that I slept profoundly, yet I did. But I would rather never sleep again than awake so horribly. I awoke in the darkness of day. I was to behold the light no more, nor to watch those divisions of time, which, by measuring our portions of suffering, appear to diminish them. When the clock strikes, we know an hour of wretchedness is past, never to return. My only timekeeper was the approach of the monk, who every day renewed my allowance of bread and water. And had he been the object I loved most on earth, the sound of his steps could not have made more delicious music. These eras, by which we compute the hours of darkness and inanity, are inconceivable to any but those who are situated as I was. You have heard, sir, no doubt, that the eye which, on its being first immersed into darkness, appears deprived of the power of vision forever, acquires, imperceptibly, a power of accommodating itself to its darkened sphere, and even of distinguishing objects by a kind of conventional light. The mind certainly possesses the same power. Otherwise, how could I have had the power to reflect, to summon some resolution, and even to indulge some hope in this frightful abode? Thus it is, when all the world seems sworn to hostility against us, we turn friends to ourselves with all the obstinacy of despair. And while all the world is flattering and deifying us, we are the perpetual victims of lassitude and self-reproach. The prisoner whose hours are visited by a dream of emancipation is less a prey to ennui than the sovereign on a throne, begirt with adulation, voluptuousness, and satiety. I reflected that all my papers were safe, that my cause was prosecuting with vigor, that, owing to my brother's zeal, I had the ablest advocate in Madrid, that they dared not murder me, and were answerable with the whole credit of the house for my reappearance whenever the courts demanded it, that the very rank of my family was a powerful protection, though none of them but my generous, fiery Juan was probably favorable to me, that if I was permitted to receive and read the advocate's first memoir, even through the hands of the superior, it was absurd to imagine that I could be denied intercourse with him in a more advanced and important stage of the business. These were the suggestions of my hope, and they were plausible enough. What were the suggestions of my despair? I shudder, even at this moment, to reflect on. The most terrible of all was, that I might be murdered conventually before it was possible that my liberation could be accomplished. Such, sir, were my reflections. You may ask, what were my occupations? My situation supplied me with those, and revolting as they were still occupations. I had my devotions to perform. Religion was my only resource in solitude and darkness, and while I prayed only for liberty and peace, I felt I was not at least insulting God by the prayers of hypocrisy, which I would have been compelled to utter in the choir. There I was obliged to join in a sacrifice that was odious to me and offensive to him. In my dungeon I offered up the sacrifice of my heart, and felt it was not unacceptable. During the glimpse of light afforded me by the reproach of the monk who brought me bread and water, I arranged the crucifix so as that I could feel it when I awoke. This was very often, and not knowing whether it was day or night, I uttered my prayers at random. I knew not whether it was matins or vespers. There was neither morning or evening for me. But it was like a talisman to me to touch the crucifix, and I said, as I felt for it, "My God is with me in the darkness of my dungeon. He is a God who has suffered, and can pity me. My extremest point of wretchedness can be nothing to what this symbol of divine humiliation for the sins of man has undergone for mine." And I kissed the sacred image, with lips wandering from the darkness, with more emotion than I had ever felt when I saw it illuminated by the blaze of tapers, amid the elevation of the host, the tossing of the perfumed censers, the gorgeous habits of the priests, and the breathless prostration of the faithful. I had other occupations, less dignified, but quite as necessary. The reptiles, who filled the hole into which I had been thrust, gave me opportunity for a kind of constant, miserable, ridiculous hostility. My mat had been placed in the very seat of warfare. I shifted it. Still they pursued me. I placed it against the wall. The cold crawling of their bloated limbs often awoke me from my sleep, and still oftener made me shudder when I awake. I struck at them. I tried to terrify them by my voice, to arm myself against them by the help of my mat. But, above all, my anxiety was ceaseless to defend my bread from their loathsome incursions, and my pitcher of water from their dropping into it. I adopted 1,000 precautions, trivial as they were inefficacious, but still there was occupation. I do assure you, sir, I had more to do in my dungeon than in my cell. To be fighting with reptiles in the dark appears the most horrible struggle that can be assigned to man. But what is it compared to his combat with those reptiles which his own heart hourly engenders in a cell, and of which, if his heart be the mother, solitude is the father? I had another employment. I cannot call it occupation. I had calculated with myself that 60 minutes made an hour, and 60 seconds a minute. I began to think I could keep time as accurately as any clock in a convent, and measure the hours of my confinement, or my release. So I sat and counted 60. A doubt always occurred to me that I was counting them faster than the clock. Then I wished to be the clock. Then I might have no feeling, no motive for hurrying on the approach of time. Then I reckoned slower. Sleep sometimes overtook me in this exercise. Perhaps I adopted it from that hope. But when I awoke, I applied to it again instantly. Thus I oscillated, reckoned, and measured time on my mat, while time withheld its delicious diary of rising and setting suns, of the dews of dawn and of twilight, of the glow of morning and the shades of the evening. When my reckoning was broken by my sleep, and I knew not whether I slept by day or night, I tried to eke it out by my incessant repetition of minutes and seconds, and I succeeded. For I always consoled myself that, whatever hour it was, 60 minutes must go to an hour. Had I led this life much longer, I might have been converted into the idiot who, as I have read, from the habit of watching a clock, imitated its mechanism so well that when it was down, he sounded the hour as faithfully as ear could desire. Such was my life. On the 4th day, as I reckon by the visits of the monk, he placed my bread and water on the block of stone as usual, but hesitated for some time before he departed. In fact, he felt a repugnance at delivering an intimation of hope. It was not consonant either to his profession or the office which, in the wantonness of monastic malignity, he had accepted as penance. You shudder at this, sir, but it is nevertheless true. This man thought he was doing service to God by witnessing the misery of a being incarcerated amid famine, darkness, and reptiles. He recoiled when his penance terminated. Alas! How false is that religion which makes our aggravating the sufferings of others our mediator with that God who willeth all men to be saved. But this is the question to be solved in convents. This man hesitated long, struggled with the ferocity of his nature, and at last departed and bolted the door, that he might indulge it a few moments longer. Perhaps in those moments he prayed to God, and ejaculated a petition that this protraction of my sufferings might be accepted as amelioration of his own. I dare say he was very sincere. But if men were taught to look at the one great sacrifice, would they be so ready to believe that their own, or those of others, could ever be accepted as a commutation for it? You are surprised, sir, at these sentiments from a Catholic, but another part of my story will disclose the cause of my uttering them. At length, this man could delay his commission no longer. He was obliged to tell me that the Superior was moved by my sufferings, that God has touched his heart in my behalf, and that he permitted me to quit my dungeon. The words were scarce out of his mouth before I rose and rushed out with a shout that electrified him. Emotion is very unusual in convents, and the expression of joy a phenomenon. I had gained the passage before he recovered his surprise, and the convent walls, which I had considered as those of a prison, now appeared the area of emancipation. Had its doors been thrown open to me that moment, I don't think I could have felt a more exquisite sensibility of liberty. I fell on my knees in the passage to thank God. I thanked him for the light, for the air, for the restored power of respiration. As I was uttering these effusions, certainly not the least sincere that were ever poured forth within those walls, suddenly I became sick. My head swam round. I had feasted on the light to excess. I fell to the ground, and remember nothing for many hours afterwards. When I recovered my senses, I was in my cell, which appeared just as I had left it. It was daylight. However, and I am persuaded that circumstance contributed more to my restoration than the food and cordials with which I was now liberally supplied. All that day I heard nothing, and had time to meditate on the motives of the indulgence with which I had been treated. I conceived that an order might have been issued to the superior to produce me, or, at all events, that he could not prevent those interviews between the advocate and me, which the former might insist on as necessary while my cause was carrying on. Towards evening, some monks entered my cell. They talked of indifferent matters, affected to consider my absence as the result of indisposition, and I did not undeceive them. They mentioned, as if incidentally, that my father and mother, overwhelmed with grief at the scandal I had brought on religion by appealing against my vows, had quitted Madrid. At this intelligence I felt much more emotion than I showed. I asked them how long had I been ill? They answered 4 days. This confirmed my suspicions with regard to the cause of my liberation, for the advocate's letter had mentioned that on the 5th day he would require an interview with me on the subject of my appeal. They then departed, but I was soon to receive another visitor. After vespers, from which I was excused, the superior entered my cell alone. He approached my bed. I attempted to rise, but he desired me to compose myself, and sat down near me with a calm but penetrating look. He said, "You have now found we have it in our power to punish." I never doubted it. "Before you tempt that power to an extremity, which, I warn you, you will not be able to endure, I come to demand of you to resign this desperate appeal against your vows, which can terminate only in dishonoring God and disappointing yourself." My father, without entering into details, which the steps taken on both sides have rendered wholly unnecessary, I can only reply that I will support my appeal with every power Providence puts within my reach, and that my punishment has only confirmed my resolution. "And this is your final determination?" "It is, and I implore you to spare me all further importunity. It will be useless." He was silent for a long time. At length he said, "And you will insist on your right to an interview with the advocate tomorrow?" "I shall claim it." "It will not be necessary, however, to mention to him your late punishment." These words struck me. I comprehended the meaning which he wished to conceal in them, and I answered, "It may not be necessary, but it will probably be expedient." "How?" "Would you violate the secrets of the house, while you are yet within its walls?" "Pardon me, father, for saying that you must be conscious of having exceeded your duty to be so anxious for its concealment. It is not, then, the secrets of your discipline, but the violation of it I shall have to disclose." He was silent, and I added, "If you have abused your power, though I have been the sufferer, it is you who are guilty." The superior rose and quitted my cell in silence. The next morning I attended matins. Service went on as usual, but at its conclusion, when the community were about to rise from their knees, the superior, striking the desk violently with his hand, commanded them all to remain in the same posture. He added, in a thundering voice, "The intercession of this whole community with God is supplicated for a monk who, abandoned by the Spirit of God, is about to commit an act dishonorable to him, disgraceful to the Church, and infallibly destructive of his own salvation." At these terrible sounds, the monks, all shuddering, sunk on their knees again. I was kneeling among them, when the superior, calling me by my name, said aloud, "Rise, wretch! Rise, and pollute not our incense with your unhallowed breath." I rose trembling and confounded, and shrunk to my cell, where I remained till I was summoned by a monk to the parlour, to meet the advocate who waited for me there. This interview was rendered quite ineffective by the presence of the monk, who was desired by the superior to witness our conference, and whom the advocate could not order away. When we entered into details, He interrupted us with declarations that his duty would not permit such a violation of the rules of the parlour. When I asserted a fact, he contradicted it, gave me the lie repeatedly, and finally disturbed the purpose of our conference so completely that in mere self-defence I spoke of the subject of my punishment, which he could not deny, and to which my livid looks bore a testimony invincible. The moment I spoke on this subject, the monk became silent. He was treasuring every word for the superior, and the advocate redoubled his attention. He took minutes of everything I said, and appeared to lay more stress on the matter than I had imagined, or indeed wished for. When the conference was over, I retired again to my cell. The advocate's visits were repeated for some days, till he had obtained the information requisite for carrying on my suit, and, during this time, my treatment in the convent was such as to give me no cause of complaint, and this, doubtless, was the motive of their forbearance. But the moments those visits ceased, the warfare of persecution commenced. They considered me as one with whom no measures were to be kept, and they treated me accordingly. I am convinced it was their intention that I should not survive the event of my appeal. At least it is certain they left nothing unaccomplished that could verify that intention. This began, as I mentioned, on the day of the advocate's last visit. The bell rung for refection. I was going to take my place as usual, when the superior said, "Hold, place a mat for him in the midst of the hall." This was done, and I was required to sit down on it, and supplied with bread and water. I ate a little, which I moistened with my tears. I foresee what I had to undergo, and did not attempt to expostulate. When grace was about to be said, I was desired to stand without the door, lest my presence should frustrate the benediction they implored. I retired, and when the bell rung for vespers, I presented myself among the rest at the door of the church. I was surprised to find it shut, and they all assembled. When the bell ceased, the superior appeared, the door was opened, and the monks hurried in. I was following when the superior repelled me, exclaiming, "You wretch! You! Remain where you are." I obeyed, and the whole community entered the church, while I remained at the door. This species of excommunication produced its full effect of terror on me. As the monks slowly came out, and cast on me looks of silent horror, I thought myself the most abject being on earth. I could have hid myself under the pavement till the event of my appeal was over. The next morning, when I went to matins, the same scene was renewed, with a horrible addition of audible reproaches, and almost imprecations, denounced against me as they entered and returned. I knelt at the door. I did not answer a word. I returned not railing for railing, and lifted up my heart with a trembling hope that this offering might be as acceptable to God as the sonorous chaunt of the choir, which I still felt it was miserable to be excluded from joining. In the course of the day, every sluice of monastic malignity and vengeance was thrown open. I appeared at the door of the refectory. I did not dare to enter. Alas! Sir, how are monks employed in the hour of refection? It is an hour when, while they swallow their meal, they banquet on the little scandal of the convent. They ask, who was late at prayers, who was to undergo penance. This serves them for conversation, and the details of their miserable life supply no other subject for that mixture of exhaustless malignity and curiosity, which are the inseparable twins of monastic birth. As I stood at the door of the refectory, a lay brother, to whom the superior nodded, bid me retire. I went to my cell, waited for several hours, and just when the bell for vespers had rung, was supplied with food, which famine itself would have shrunk from. I tried to swallow it, but could not, and hurried away as the bell tolled to attend vespers, for I wished to have no cause of complaint against my neglect of duties. I hastened down. The door was again shut. Service began, and again I was compelled to retire without partaking of it. The next day I was excluded from matins. The same degrading scene was acted over when I appeared at the door of the refectory. Food was sent to my cell, that a dog would have rejected, and the door was shut when I attempted to enter the church. 1,000 circumstances of persecution, too contemptible, too minute, either for recollection or repetition, but infinitely harassing to the sufferer, were heaped on me every day. Imagine, sir, a community of upwards of 60 persons, all sworn to each other to make the life of one individual insupportable, joined in a common resolution to insult, harass, torment, and persecute him. And then imagine how that individual can support such a life. I began to dread the preservation of my reason, of my existence, which, miserable as it was, still fed on the hope of my appeal. I will sketch one day of my life for you. Ex uno dice omnes. I went down to matins and knelt at the door. I did not dare to enter. When I retired to my cell, I found the crucifix taken away. I was about to go to the superior's apartment to complain of this outrage. In the passage, I happened to meet a monk and 2 boarders. They all shrunk close to the walls. They drew in their garments, as if trembling to encounter the pollution of my touch. I said mildly, "There is no danger. The passage is wide enough." The monk replied, "Apage Satana, my children," addressing the boarders. "Repeat with me, Apage Satana, avoid the approach of that demon who insults the habit he desecrates." They did so, and to render the exorcism complete, they spit in my face as they passed. I wiped it off and thought how little of the Spirit of Jesus was to be found in the house of his nominal brethren. I proceeded to the apartment of the superior, and knocked timidly at the door. I heard the words, "Enter in peace," and I prayed that it might be in peace. As I opened the door, I saw several monks assembled with the superior. The latter uttered an exclamation of horror when he saw me, and threw his robe over his eyes. The monks understood the signal. The door was closed, and I was excluded. That day I waited several hours in my cell before any food was brought to me. There is no state of feeling that exempts us from the wants of nature. I had no food for many days, requisite for the claims of adolescence, which were then rapidly manifesting themselves in my tall but attenuated frame. I descended to the kitchen to ask for my share of food. The cook crossed himself as I appeared at the door, for even at the door of the kitchen I faltered at the threshold. He had been taught to consider me as a demon incarnate, and shuddered while he asked, "What do you want?" "Food," I replied, "food, that is all." "Well, you shall have it, but come no further, there is food." And he flung me the offal of the kitchen of the earth, and I was so hungry that I devoured it eagerly. The next day I was not so lucky. The cook had learned the secret of the convent, that of tormenting those whom they no longer have hopes of commanding, and mixed the fragments he threw to me with ashes, hair, and dust. I could hardly pick out a morsel that, famished as I was eatable. They allowed me no water in my cell. I was not permitted to partake of it at refection. And in the agonies of thirst, aggravated by my constant solicitude of mind, I was compelled to kneel at the brink of the well, as I had no vessel to drink out of, and take up the water in my hand, or lap it up like a dog. If I descended to the garden for a moment, they took the advantage of my absence to enter my cell and remove or destroy every article of furniture. I have told you that they took away my crucifix. I had still continued to kneel and repeat my prayers before the table on which it stood. That was taken away. Table, chair, missal, rosary, everything disappeared gradually, and my cell presented nothing but 4 bare walls, with a bed, on which they had rendered it impossible for me to taste repose. Perhaps they dreaded I might, however, and they hit on an expedient which, if it had succeeded, might have deprived me of reason as well as repose. End of Chapter 6, Part 2. Recording by Kendra Lee Oberhauser, Berkeley, California.